Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. And welcome everybody to the IHPI seminar today. I'm Sarah Hawley. I'm the faculty lead for education and training within IHPI. And we're super excited today to have a unique panel on a unique topic today, enriching science, education, practice, and policy with narrative and the humanities. We are going to be moderated today by Dr. Kara Zivin. She is a professor of psychiatry, obstetrics, gynecology, and health management and policy. I'll briefly name each of our panelists who we're very excited and grateful have agreed to join us today for a conversation on this topic. I just wanted to highlight that this topic is becoming increasingly relevant. We saw Kara shared with us a New York Times piece that came out this week on this very topic. I'm happy to share that around if people are interested, but particularly with the pandemic, we're seeing a real call for kind of thinking about this issue of narrative medicine and the humanities. So before I name our panelists, I want to just mention a couple of housekeeping things. I think everybody is doing this, but please stay on mute and go ahead and chat your comments. This is a more interactive session today, so Kara and I will kind of keep our eye on the chat, and we may, ask people to unmute and have discussion with the panelists as we get through the various questions. At the end, we're going to try for the first time breakout rooms. So I think when you entered, you indicated if you were interested in going into a breakout room. If you said no and you're interested, you can still go into a breakout room at the end. People who are still here will be separated by Stacy into rooms just to continue the conversation. So if you're interested, we encourage you to give that a try. Two upcoming events that Stacy will put into the chat just so you have them. We're very excited on May 6th to have the director's lecture with Dr. Sanjay Gupta. So please, I'm sure you all saw that come out, but please consider attending that exciting seminar. And on 5/13, we have choosing patient-reported outcome measures for improving patient monitoring and outcome assessment. So keep your eye peeled for that. So with that, as I mentioned, we have Dr. Kara Zivin here to monitor today. Thank you, Kara. On the panel, we have four guests today. We have Dr. Mary Blazek, a clinical associate professor of psychiatry. We have Dr. Laura Hirschbein, a professor of psychiatry and history. We have Dr. Pooja Lagisetty, an assistant professor of internal medicine. And we have Dr. David Porter, a professor of English and comparative literature. So with that, Kara, please.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We're so excited about having this panel. This actually has been in the works for about 2 years now. It's hard to believe from the pre-pandemic era. The IHPI team had reached out to me about possibly hosting a session, and I proposed this, and then we were supposed to meet about a year ago, and then we all know where we were about a year ago. So here we are today, and I think it's given all of us some time for this topic to germinate in our minds over time. So what I thought I would do is, since this is in some ways a discussion about storytelling, I'm going to give each of our panelists a chance to tell their story and how it connects to this topic. And then try to bring in questions for the whole group as well as the audience. And I'll start with my own about, how did I get here? I'm actually a health services researcher and policy researcher by training and focus on behavioral health. And I was typically fairly quantitative in my research studies and, used a lot of regression analyses and wrote papers that have objectives, methods, results, conclusions, or grants that have specific aims and background, approach, those kinds of things. But I went through. I've also always approached research in topics that were personally meaningful or interesting to me. I think I almost use my own life as a research topic to try to understand, and you can't always do that with data, even though that's one approach. I also differentiate telling stories from qualitative data analysis that many of us do in mixed methods or qualitative only studies, because I think there are different tools that we use when we talk about things like creative nonfiction. And I don't mean that is sort of, when I told someone I was doing creative nonfiction once, they said, "Oh, my tax returns look like a creative nonfiction." And I was like, that's not exactly what I mean. But, using some of the tools that are used in writing, such as thinking about verb tense and point of view. And, a memoir, for example, is not just everything that's ever happened in your life. You have to craft and shape what it comes in and what you leave out and how you tell the tale and in what order. And so I wanted to learn some of those tools to apply to some of my own experiences. Some of you may know or have seen that I have talked about publicly and published about my own personal experience with perinatal depression about a decade ago. And I've both published now a few essays and some podcasts, and was trying to figure out how to approach that topic writing. And I both really delved into the literature and decided I wanted to focus my own research in that area, but I also wanted to learn some of the tools and skills to talk about it in a more artistic way. And I began an M.F.A. program a few years ago while I was still here on faculty doing my research studies to learn some of these techniques. And so when I had this opportunity to potentially do this seminar, I wanted to talk with other individuals across campus who have been, coming from one potential disciplinary topic, but trying to incorporate other modalities in their work. And so I'm going to pause on my own, my own piece right now and sort of bring in each of our people in our panel, and then we can talk more as we go forward. I'm also happy to share some of each of our work with all of you going forward, just so you can get an idea of what we're talking about. So I'm going to start first with Dr. Pooja Lagisetty, who is an internal medicine physician here, and she holds a waiver to administer medications to people with substance use disorders. And she shared a piece relatively early in her career in 2017 in Health Affairs in a monthly column called Narrative Matters that was titled The Fine Line Between Doctoring and Dealing. And so Pooja, I wanted to see if you could tell us about how you came to this topic, how even specifically you engaged with the journal, how this was different from other research that you do, any concerns or questions you had about doing this work. So if you could just give us some background on that, that would be great.
Great, thanks, Kara. I'm excited to be here and feel a bit of imposter syndrome with my fellow panelists. So I, as Kara mentioned, I'm a primary care physician who spends a lot of time treating patients with addiction and chronic pain. And I wrote, a Narrative Matters piece, which for those of you who aren't familiar with health affairs, it's essentially a personal narrative mixed with a little bit of policy implications with respect to the narrative piece. And so it was a story about one of the patients that I had seen and kind of grappling with this idea of how, how different I was from potentially a drug dealer with prescribing opioids and kind of the lessons that my patient had taught me about this conundrum. And I guess, to your point, Kara, of how I got there, I actually, the humanities is probably where I, in some ways, feel more comfortable. My undergrad degrees in art, and I've kind of written a little bit, throughout kind of my, teenage and beyond. And so I would say the science part was a bit new to me. And so when I wrote the essay, I would probably say I was stronger in kind of creative writing than I was in scientific writing. I think I probably had written like maybe 2 scientific papers at that point that had been, thank you, Michelle Heiser, for heavily editing them and making them publishable. And so I just feel like at that point, it felt more comfortable writing creative pieces. And so I had this piece for quite some time, for about a year or 2 that I had been sitting on. And then during the Clinician Scholars Program, it was a year where we had had a writing workshop that was led by a couple of faculty from Yale. And it was time for me to kind of dust it off and workshop it with my peers, which kind of got it to a point where it was in a state to be published. And then I actually submitted it initially to JAMA in the form of just a perspective piece. And a much shorter piece. And I think, they had even given me the feedback that it was just too much in too little space. And so I kind of refashioned it for Health Affairs as they had a bigger word count and was able to kind of get in more of the nuance that I wanted to. and got it into health affairs. And it's now also like part of a compilation book that's been published as well with other narrative matters pieces. And so in general, it was a good experience, and happy to talk about it more if others have questions.
Thank you. I have lots of questions, but I want to bring everybody into the conversation. So next I'm going to turn to Dr. Laura Hirschbein. She is a psychiatrist, but also holds a Ph.D. in history. And one of her books I've come to again and again, American Melancholy, Constructions of Depression in the 20th Century, published in 2009. And I wanted you to share with us how you came to doing this work. I don't know a lot of people that have backgrounds in both history and in medicine, and just how this, tell us about your career in this area.
So I think like many of us, I started off not being very scientific. I was an English major in college and decided that I wanted to go help people. And so decided medical school was a good idea. So I started medical school kind of naively thinking that doctors are all people who just want to help people. And I sat through 2 years of endless lectures by a whole bunch of white men who were very certain that they knew exactly what was happening, even as they made what in hindsight are breathtakingly misogynist and racist and homophobic comments just sprinkled throughout everything that they were saying. And I had gone to Oberlin College, so I was full of liberal energy and was just appalled by everything that people were saying, and there was no place for critical thinking. And then I went to a lecture that really changed everything, and that was Joel Howell gave his annual lecture on the Tuskegee syphilis study. And I thought, wow, this is who is thinking critically. This is who is really asking questions. Why are we doing what we're doing? How did we get here? What kinds of mistakes happened along the way? And so I decided to take a break between second and third year of med school and go get a PhD. It seemed like, sure, why not? I could do it at the time. So I did. And to be honest, I'm not sure I would have come back. I had been I really was not a fan of medicine by then. And I got married to a fellow graduate student in the history of medicine. And we sat around talking one day about job prospects. And he said, well, one of us is partway through training for a job that will pay no matter what. So I thought, okay, well, I guess I'm going back to med school. So I came back and have been combining the history with medicine. I didn't originally intend to do psychiatry, like many of us. It kind of grabbed me, and I didn't really feel like I had a choice. But those two have really fit together so well because there are so many important, really critical questions that I feel that we need to ask about what we're doing. And for me, asking questions keeps me humble. It keeps me kind of thinking of and really wrestling with patients, with consumers, with however people understand themselves, that we may think that we're certain right now, but there's so much that can change, and we're humans in this ever-changing context. So thinking about the history keeps me critical. It keeps me honest. It keeps me saying I don't know when I don't know. And for me, it's been both incredibly intellectually exciting to be asking historical questions, and also really enriching of my patient experience to be always thinking about this particular patient in the bigger context, and how do we know what we know, and really taking hard issues and wrestling with them, and always asking more questions. And those two, again, have gone together really well. And I've been really lucky that I'm in a department that supports me doing this work.
Great. Well, I know I've looked to you in the department as a role model in doing sort of this interdisciplinary work. So now I want to turn to Dr. Mary Blazek, who's a geriatric psychiatrist, but she also serves as the Director of Medical Humanities Path of Excellence at U of M. So I was hoping that she could tell us about this component, because I did not know a lot about it, how, her engagement with medical students and how she became involved in this role.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you so much for gathering us together in this panel. And I think it would be helpful, before I tell my own story, just to fill people in on what the Path of Excellence is. Laura was alluding to her medical school experience in the past. But over the past decade or so, many medical schools in the United States have gone through curricular transformation. So medical school doesn't look the same now as it did 20 or 30 years ago. They accelerate the foundational coursework and lectures in the first year. Used to take 2 years. And now we get students onto the wards and into the clinical settings in the second year. So they can build on their foundational knowledge by applying it in the clinical setting. So in 2015, I was hoping to I started really embracing the pedagogy of teaching and the scholarship of learning and teaching. And so I completed a master's in education for health professions. And this was just the time of the development of the new curriculum. And I thought, I want to get in on this. And I joined a work group that was exploring the concept of a longitudinal elective over 4 years in scholarly concentration. So students could take a deeper dive in areas of their interest or passion. And this developed into the Paths of Excellence program. The paths cover many areas of interest, including medical ethics, scientific discovery, global health disparities, to name a few of the 8. And on that work group, I saw the student interest in the medical humanities. And so I kind of championed developing a path in the medical humanities, and I got to be the director. And the medical humanities are the interface between all of the humanities and all things related to medicine. So they're very broad, vast, diverse, and different places define it differently. I had been an English major, and I played the violin. I love the arts and theater, but I have no specific expertise. So I realized I could use my educational experience and kind of develop the program and then serve as the ringleader, master of ceremonies for the different experiences we would provide. But I really hoped to develop and sustain the path by gathering a consortium of experienced physicians who also had expertise in different disciplines. And Dr. Hirshbein is one of those. She is our expert in the history of medicine. Dr. Joel Howell, whom she referenced as sparking her interest in medical history and is also a medical historian, leads our performing arts component. We have Dr. Nan Barbas, who teaches neuro medicine, Dr. Janet Gilsdorf, creative writing, and Dr. Howard Markell, another medical historian, also contributed to the development of the path. They are all physicians and bring their clinical experience to inform these connections to the humanities. We also are fortunate to have Ruth Slavin, who is a museum educator. And she not only leads the visual arts component, but because she has experience collaborating with medical educators, she can enhance every activity that we do. So we're very grateful to have her. And we also have a tradition of having junior faculty or members in training as part of our faculty. They're closer to the student experience. And currently we have John David Ike, who's an internal medicine faculty and a research fellow, and Julie Blazek, her name is close to mine, who is the family medicine education fellow. And they participate with us as faculty. Students join the path in the M1 year, the first year of medical school, and we have some sampler sessions touching on all of these disciplines and try to develop a sense of a learning community who will travel the 4 years of medical school together using the lens of the humanities to explore and understand their own experiences as students, emerging physicians, and the experiences of their patients, families, peers. We never have formal lectures. All our sessions are interactive with active learning. One faculty leads and all the others participate just along with the students. We average about 10 students per year, but because many of our students pursue dual degrees, they're around longer and they continue to participate. So there are a few more students on the path than just the 10 per year. We've had some sessions, some examples were an activity that Anne Mondro from the School of Art and Design does with patients with dementia and community volunteers, where we drew plants without looking at the paper. It was a lot of fun. We've gone up in the Carillon of the Lurie Tower for a concert about social justice. And we had one session called Let's Have Dinner and Talk About Death, led by one of the University Hospital chaplains. Through all these sessions, we use writing for reflection on our experiences, even if it's just to gather our thoughts and share. And through these experiences, I really learn and grow as much as the students do. And I think the other faculty members feel the same. After students complete their clerkship year, they must, and I should say they get to, complete a capstone project in their own area of interest. And this is all medical students. They're given time and financial resources. Students on our path can pursue creative projects, which is a lot of fun. And our path faculty serve as advisors or link them to advisors in the larger university or in the community. Some exciting projects students have done. One student, after completing a master's of public health and learning about qualitative analysis, she decided to interview her own family about their healthcare experiences as immigrants. She coded and analyzed the themes and then used those themes to write a song and performed it with the rock and roll band that she was a member of. Another one wanted to learn about photography, so she created a beautiful tableau of photos which depict the transformation of her professional identity from ballerina to physician. And many students use writing or storytelling for their projects. We're starting our 6th cohort this spring.
This is great,
Students
Mary.
express-
Oh, thank you so
wrap it up.
much. Yeah, do you want to say more now? And then I just want to be sure to get David involved and hear more.
Sure. Yeah. I was just going to say that the students say that being in this path kind of sanctions or validates non-scientific activities that nurture them in their medical school experience. And I feel the same way myself as the faculty do. So we all continue to grow. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And, I realize so far we've had a physician perspective here, but when I viewed this, I purposely think of it as beyond, MD specific, but, could be public health, could be nursing, could be pharmacy, social work. And then also I want to turn now to our last speaker, Dr. David Porter, a professor of English and comparative literature and the most recent former department chair. And so in your role as chair, you created the English Department's Journalism Initiative and currently serve as principal investigator for the Detroit River Story Lab, a grant-funded interdisciplinary initiative that supports community-based efforts to connect residents with the river and its stories. And so you're going to tell us about that in just a minute, but I just wanted to say that I had reached out to Dr. Porter when I realized that their M.F.A. program was potentially interested in creative nonfiction, because it was my understanding that prior to that, there's been more of a traditional focus on poetry and in fiction. And so I wanted to learn more about, potential cross-disciplinary, cross-university interests or initiative in personal narrative. And I think, in the context of the pandemic, this is, I think, even that much more salient. And so we would love to bring you into the conversation and have you share your thoughts. Unmute.
There we go. Thank you, Cara. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm glad to have this opportunity. Someone mentioned imposter syndrome a bit earlier. I think I get to be the lead candidate for that particular diagnosis in this session, never having published a scientific paper or anything like it in my life. I can share 2 different kinds of stories with you that perhaps will fill things out a little bit. One is just my own story of how I got to do what I'm doing, and I'll summarize that very quickly, and then I'll say a little bit about, to elaborate on kind of some of your observations about student trends and about collaborations that we've developed between the humanities and other fields in recent years, and why I think they're important, specifically with respect to narrative. So just the way I think I would characterize my own trajectory as a faculty member here, I've been here for about 25 years, and I was hired by the English department as a literature person. And of course, like other traditionally trained literature people, I spent many, many years doing deep dives into fairly esoteric and theoretical and historical questions having to do with literary and cultural history and so on. And found a lot of satisfaction there and a lot of grist for various kinds of intellectual mills. But at a certain point, which more or less corresponded with when I became a department chair, interestingly, I'm not quite sure about the cause and effect there, I became much more interested in stepping back, taking a step back from the kind of detailed, disciplinary, hyper-specialized studies that I was accustomed to spending my time doing, take a step back and to think about well, the question suggested by the name of the journal that was mentioned earlier, narrative matters. Well, why does narrative matter? Why does story matter? Why do we study stories in the first place? And it's not really a question, it's a question that's in some sense too obvious ever to be taken up in an English department, right? You get to an English department, you take those things for granted, and then you just dive in and you do these very close studies of different kinds of literary works. And I found myself as a department chair, given the kind of administrative or kind of bird's eye perspective that one gets in those roles, thinking a lot about the kind of big picture questions about the discipline, and of course then about my own work. So since in the second half of my 5-year term, and then in the months since, I've been spending a lot more time focusing explicitly on those high level issues. What is story? Why does story matter? And especially, how does story matter for the University of Michigan at this time and in this place? It seems to me a critical juncture for the university, with its increasing sort of mandate to be accountable to broader publics, to engage in community-based learning and so on, to take story seriously, not only as a theoretical concern, but also as the basis for conversation and partnership with community stakeholders. So that's so my own trajectory has been sort of from the inside of the discipline, working out to this big picture perspective. I would complement that with an observation about some trends I've seen in student interest in the English department that I saw as department chair, and that I think have, if anything, only been strengthened over our past pandemic year. I guess I've seen a shift in student interest from literature in the traditional sense, the study of literature as in, specializing in Renaissance drama or 18th century novel or something, to creative writing, right? So from the historical studies to creative studies. And within the field of creative writing, I've seen a trend from the creative writing of fiction and poetry towards creative nonfiction. And within creative nonfiction itself, I've seen increasing emphasis in student interest towards the gritty, hands-on kinds of engagement with pressing concerns that animates so much of the best long-form reflective journalism that we're seeing these days. So on issues including public health, for example, and environmental justice. So as a result of these shifts, the department in recent years developed new courses in creative nonfiction and literary journalism, all of which provide a way for to encourage students to link together their classroom training with their social commitments. And it turns out to be a very powerful combination. We've also begun building partnerships, institutional partnerships within and beyond LS&A. The English department is partnering with the UM Biostation on a new summer program that links together science and humanities and writing pursuits. The college partnered with the Office of the President to create a new Great Lakes Writers Corps. We've created with the School of Environmental Studies new courses on environmental journalism, and with urban design, this new Detroit River Story Lab, which Kara mentioned earlier. I've been thrilled to hear from Kara about the increasing interest in the medical humanities within Michigan medicine, and my colleagues and I would certainly welcome the chance to continue the conversation as these commitments develop. let me just close by sharing 3 very specific reasons that I find these developments to be so promising and so important, and reasons why I continue to advocate for narrative-based educational opportunities within my department, but also across the university. The first of the reasons is all about communication, perhaps the obvious one. Stories enable effective communication between experts and lay audiences, as well as obviously between writers and readers. But that's the kind of salient connection that we found resonates with people like the scientists at the biostation, that they want to bring in writing training to help their scientists figure out how to communicate more effectively to larger audiences, right? So communication is key. Perhaps obviously empathy also is key, obviously, but perhaps a little less so. By giving us intimate access to human experiences beyond our own stories, of course, enable empathetic identification with those unlike ourselves, right? And they enable a compassionate understanding of a wider variety of life circumstances, which is no doubt important. Every bit, perhaps even more important in your fields than in mine. I know it's a goal, this goal of wide-reaching empathy is one that's widely shared among many health professionals. And then the third reason I think that narrative-based education is so important is perhaps a less familiar one, and that would be the category of epistemological awareness. Epistemological awareness. In my view, the study of literary techniques in itself contributes to a heightened understanding of how narrative and metaphor and other such devices, formal devices, constitute something like a deep structure for human cognition at a very fundamental level, and thereby shape the ways in which we intuitively form and express knowledge in subject areas, including the sciences, as well as the humanities. We often talk about kids needing to go to school and study math to develop their skills in mathematical reasoning, or to take science classes to develop their scientific reasoning. I've been increasingly intrigued by the seemingly missing category of what we might call literary reasoning, right? Or narrative reasoning, by which I refer to the ways in which our innate capacity as human beings and as readers to process narrative and metaphor can be seen as a core cognitive technology, and one which we can intentionally cultivate and help our students cultivate to enhance our performance and effectiveness in just about any field you can think of. So these 3 reasons, effective communication, extended empathy, and epistemological awareness seem to me to represent 3 of the key resources that the study of narrative can bring to the table, and 3 of the capacities that I'm hoping we can find additional ways to cultivate in our students.
I really appreciate your perspective, especially the last point. I feel like from a perspective of having spent, my career in more scientifically oriented research and then doing an M.F.A, it's kind of ruined me. So I think for my collaborators on some of my scientific papers, because I start to get upset about passive voice or, verbs of being, or just these, and I think my co-authors get a bit annoyed at me that I'm marking everything up, but I feel much more engaged, and or even just the language that we use. I would never use the word perhaps or even the word like in a scientific paper, but perhapsing and simile and all these things are of course necessary in creative writing. So sometimes I feel like my brain is split and I'm going back and forth, and it can be a little bit jarring. But I'm interested to get some reactions from our panel on some of the points that you just made, if anybody would like to step in. And then we have a few questions that were sent in advance, and then I'll see if anybody wants to talk in the chat, because we already are getting through our time. So does somebody want to step in? Laura, Pooja? I
wanted to comment. It's really interesting that both Pooja and David were talking about imposter syndrome, because the reality is for all of us, imposter syndrome is like that. I think I just stopped thinking, wait, they made me a faculty member and I've been on faculty for 20 years. So that, it doesn't entirely go away, but this idea that somehow having a story to tell isn't enough I think that is something that I want to break down, because those stories are important, that having a story to tell is enough. It makes you part of the conversation. And I think that's one of the reasons that narrative is so important, that, you know, the very, very, very old idea of a physician-directed narrative that captures everything that happens with patients, we've been taking that apart for decades, you know, perhaps even centuries. So the narratives coming from all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons are critical, and those are all valuable. And so I think that we all need to be in practice of validating the fact that narratives matter, regardless of whose narratives they are.
Sure, Mary, go ahead.
Yes, I love that you gave us 3 points to focus on. That was really helpful. And we're doing more work with narrative in medical schools across the country, but it often is for self-selected students who say, I'm interested in this, I'm confident that I know I want to do this. And I think there are everyone can benefit, even if they're not comfortable or think that they can benefit. And so I'm hopeful that we can integrate in small ways an appreciation for storytelling and narrative, because it's so part of the human experience. It connects us to others, and we see things through others' eyes and others' experiences. So thank you for that.
And actually, and maybe Pooja, you want to respond to this too. You know, when we think about what are different approaches, that was one of the questions we had, of how scientists or how researchers or people who are not traditionally maybe as used to or comfortable using narrative, how do we get our points across? You know, how do we translate complicated findings into the lay audience, which is another topic that came up. And I think, you know, I'm actually participating in something called a media and medicine intensive through Harvard University right now. And, you know, it's beyond just writing. That's my personal interest, but people are talking about plays, or, you know, there could be pottery, or, you know, crochet, or, you know, but also op-eds, policy briefs, podcasts, I think have sort of exploded in the context of pandemic, because it's something we can all do and listen to. And yet I find them really interesting and fascinating. And I think others maybe, you know, you can sort of on any topic, but, you know, and also, you know, there was as part of this question, someone was asking, you know, is this about sharing experiences or modeling behavior? And I know for me, that's something I'm trying to do, as much as, you know, talking about mental health in particular, I think is very stigmatized, right? As much as some of us in the field may not want it to be. And yet I feel like it's that much more incumbent upon me as a faculty member to speak openly, because if I can't, then I imagine other people may feel even less comfortable being open in these areas. But, you know, I'm interested in this topic of, you know, how do we actually go about doing this, you know, because so I think, you know, obviously this is not a randomly selected group of people on this panel, you know, but if people have thoughts on, okay, so how do we move from here going forward? What would be of interest? What would be useful around, you know, engaging narrative and our science? So I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts you might want to say on that.
I could try to comment on this. You know, I think it's interesting just hearing these comments, because I actually think that perhaps more of our students, at least coming through our traditional kind of undergrad, you know, high school and college background, actually probably have more experience writing narrative pieces than they do scientific pieces. I mean, I know that I didn't write my first scientific paper until, you know, 6 or 7 years ago. And so I actually, you know, I think that what unfortunately maybe happens in the audience of kind of our field is that we perhaps lose that skill as we start to shift towards more scientific writing. And so maybe there is this like inkling of like, I'd love to tell this story, but like, I'm, you know, that's part of my imposter syndrome, is like, do I still have the skills to do it? You know, because I used to do it more regularly. You know, I painted for years and picked up a paintbrush more recently in the last 2 years, and felt similarly of like, can I still do it? Am I still good? And so I think we start to kind of doubt our ability to do this, even though we probably did do this in high school when we wrote essays and were forced to do creative writing or whatnot. And it's just a matter of kind of dusting off that space. I think the other really big benefit of kind of the humanities, whether it be the visual arts or writing, for me is this idea of like chipping away at something until it becomes good. This idea that it's not perfect on first round, and that like you really have to keep shaping it. And that's a good lesson, I think, for folks, especially med students who are really type A and tend to be good at something right away. And when they're not, they can get frustrated. It's like a good skill set to just highlight to them that slow process of editing is like what all the authors do. All the great artists edit, and what they start with, what they end with is not what they thought they were going to start, when they started. But that process, I think, can be a good one for folks like me who are type A, to kind of remind myself that it's a process and not the end finding.
David, did you want to weigh in? Okay, yeah.
Sure, I can chime in. I guess I don't know a whole lot about what's happening here already, so I hesitate to weigh in with anything prescriptive. But I guess my intuition in thinking about ways of juxtaposing these two forms of education, these two forms of processing experience from a student's point of view, I guess my intuition is to try to break down and to complicate the perceived or the received gap or gulf or binary as much as possible, so that in addition to talking about stories or narrative as a kind of parallel track or parallel universe to science, or stories about science, stories in the service of science, I guess if I were involved in a kind of teaching experiment in this space, I would be really intrigued to explore alongside folks in the scientific domain the possibility that stories and metaphors can be seen as constitutive of science at a very deep level, right? Which helps to get past the kind of binary opposition model, or one as being a sort of complement or a supplement to the other, that it's very hard to think about anything. It's certainly very hard to think about science or history or law absent story or metaphor, right? Philosophers get very angry when literary people say that about philosophy, because the philosophers like to think that what they're doing is objective, straightforward and rational, and keeps the sort of dangerous, mushy domains of narrative and metaphor at a distance. But that's obviously a difficult claim to hold up under scrutiny. And so I guess that would be my kind of impish intuition in approaching this, that thinking about stories or metaphors as constitutive of science or in scientific knowledge at a very deep level might be an interesting project for students to explore.
Well, and I appreciate, even if you think about just this discussion we've had here in the last, 45 minutes, like we don't have these types of talks in our normal days. At least I don't. Maybe you do in the English department. We're talking about data use agreements and IRBs and, electronic medical records and all that. And yet this is at a more like core level that I think brings out something in each of us, regardless of which perspective we're coming to it from. I just wanted to address one more question that we got before, and then please, people, if you'd like to put things in the chat, we've got about 15 minutes left, and I want to be sure to bring in the audience here. But we had another question about bibliotherapy. And so, the definition of bibliotherapy is usually using literature to help people cope with, emotional problems, mental illness, or other changes. And I don't know about others on the panel and the audience, but I often, maybe it's the researcher in me, go to the literature when I want to understand something, to feel less alone, to understand that, other women have struggled with this, or other mothers, or other, researchers. And, and that could be all forms of literature, whether it's, research articles, whether it's op-eds or long form essays, whether it's memoir, all these different types of things. And I guess I would refer to the clinicians of, like, if you ever say to a patient or a client, reading as a form of therapy in particular, But I think, why do we all go to literature is to try to understand something, but we understand something about ourselves from, engaging in the text. So I don't know if anybody wants to say anything about that particular topic, or, again, any other connections to thinking about this going forward.
We have had it's because of the season, I think, quite a number of patients on the inpatient unit recently who are bipolar and have gotten manic. It's the spring that's often what happens. And so I have to be kind of careful about recommending that they do more, because usually we want them to do less and not run off and do stuff. But I've been doing a lot of recommending Kay Jamison's work because she's like not only a model of somebody who has done a lot of writing about her own experience, but really done a lot of channeling of her own experience into her academic work at Hopkins. And so I will, and I tell patients, I can never remember which one is which, but she wrote a book, I think it's Touched by Fire, that's about her experience. And then she's written a whole bunch of other stuff academically about bipolar disorder. And many patients find that helpful because it puts their experiences into words and shows them that, this is another story of recovery and somebody who's used their own experiences to help advance science in the field. I also often will tell stories of Marsha Linehan, who is the founder of dialectical behavior therapy, which we use a lot on the inpatient unit. And Marsha didn't talk about it for years, but within the last 10 years, I think it's revealed that her therapy is around dealing with serious self-injury. And she herself had decades of serious self-injury, and it developed a therapy that was intended for people like her. So her own story is very much part of that. And patients are usually inspired that, that this is a therapy that's grounded in commonality. It's not a hierarchical top-down sort of thing. So I think patients really resonate with that. And the other thing that I will say, just sort of thinking about patient narratives, is lately, and this seems to be somewhat discipline specific, but a lot of journals, if you publish a case report, a lot of journals want the patient to give consent, and some of them want the patient's own perspective. Like, they don't want just the physicians, they want the patients. And so that's an amazing opportunity to really collaborate and to let the patient give their experience at the same time that the healthcare team is giving their experience. And it doesn't line up all the time, but when it can happen, it's really cool.
This is a little tangential maybe, but I was thinking even before you asked the last question, Cara, about the relationship between reading and writing, and how important it is to read to be a good writer, and how reading makes you a better writer, et cetera, et cetera. And it really does help you broaden your experience in ways that without traveling, there is no frigate like a book. And the kind of the growth of book clubs over the past few decades has become so common and popular. And I am tying to this to the idea of imposter syndrome. Like, you're never an imposter to tell a story or write. I mean, maybe, I don't want to keep returning to this, Pooja, because I think it's obviously a syndrome we all have. But for writing, we all can write. We don't have to be master writers, and we can grow ourselves through the process of writing, not just the outcome. And wouldn't it be cool if writing groups took off like reading groups did, and people wrote for the process of writing, not necessarily to publish or disseminate, but to have that experience?
One of my mentors in my writing program said to me, because I was really struggling with how do I integrate this into my life? I've got a busy life as it is, and how do I, because I felt like such a novice. She was like, 15 minutes a day, sit in your car, just don't be on the internet or your phone or whatever, write whatever comes to mind. And I try to do it. My dog doesn't always respect that, but I do try, because I feel like to really craft something on, so there's journaling, but there's like to really try to craft something on the page, you have to interpret and understand it in a way that you may not by speaking about it, or even in a therapy session. I feel like you can walk away and be like, what just happened? And not remember anything, but to put it on the page is challenging. But okay, so in our last few minutes, we have a question, and I don't know, Brian, if you want to come off mute and ask what you've put in the chat, or I'm happy to read it either way. So I will give you.
I'm happy to ask it if you'd like.
Okay,
so
sure.
I do work on health communication, and in particular, I both teach and research part of this on the use of patient narratives, exploring patient experience, patients' outcomes, patients, using narratives to model processes for patients to go through. And I guess much of the discussion today has been about narratives from health professionals about the experience of becoming a health professional, et cetera. And I guess I'm curious, panelists' thoughts on what the differences or similarities you see between the role of narrative for patients versus for health professionals.
That's a really great observation. I think it's particularly interesting in mental health because a lot of the patient narratives came about as a way of writing against the healthcare professionals. So there's a really great bibliography. It goes on for pages and pages and pages. That's been compiled by a psychologist whose name I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll try to put it in the chat because I have her book on my, I think it's Gail Hornstein. She wrote a book called To Save One Person is to Save the World about Frieda Fromm-Reichmann. And she's a psychologist who's been gathering patient narratives over the decades. And so Frieda Fromm-Reichmann was the psychiatrist who was mentioned in I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. So Hornstein has been gathering these patient narratives, and she's got this database that goes on and on and on. And I used quite a bit of them on a book I was writing about smoking experiences for patients. And a lot of the narratives are people saying, basically, I hated my psychiatrist. I hated what he was saying, sometimes she, and I hated everything about psychiatry. And here is my story, and here it's writing against it. And so for mental health, there really are the healthcare narratives and then the patient narratives. And so that's one of the reasons that why Kay Jamison is so interesting, because she can write on both sides. And so I think it's really interesting to be challenged by, in mental health, the patient narratives, because they're often angry or confrontational or very different, come from a different perspective.
And part of what I had been trying to characterize, and I don't know if I sort of missed the mark, was that, like, I see this as beyond the duality of patient compared to physician, but the sort of all of us, whether it's, you have an English background or you have, a background in public health or other allied health professions, or just each of us, how do we come to this role of narrative, which may or may not be different from our other professional roles, I guess is what I was trying to get at. And I think that people also write about their other experiences that are not, in the mental health space, obviously, where people are talking about, cancer recovery issues or decision making or, caregiving or grief and loss. I sort of have this fantasy that someday I'm going to get to teach a course on that, where, like, we talk about each of those things. Certainly now you're seeing a bunch of people's experience either with their own COVID experience or a family member, those kinds of things. And so I think there's only growing room for that. Yeah. So in the last few minutes, is there anything, right? Oh, Pooja, did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I think going back to your question of, like, how do we do this better, and totally taking it out of the realm of, like, me writing as a clinician versus, like, a researcher or some other role. I think that it'll be important, like, whatever is, like, we try to do in this space is getting back to that point that a few of us have made, that, like, it's the process, right? And I worry a bit, like, when you're in academia, that it's never about the process. It's about, like, the end product, right? Or did it get published or did it not? What did you do with it? And so I think, if we really kind of view it as a process that's helping our students and our faculty, then we have to be happy with it not leading to kind of publications or anything like that. Like, it could be a self process. But that feels foreign, right? Like, I can only imagine, like, if we set something like this up in academia, people are going to ask you 5 years later, like, what came out of it? Who published what? And you start to highlight these publications. and then that's where the imposter syndrome comes, right? Because it's like, you know, I want to be like so-and-so who did get their article published, or I want to be like so-and-so whose paintings are displayed. And so really being mindful of that process and what that process means and how it does impact, you know, other writing. I mean, I will say that, you know, a good grant is a story. And so, you know, it does get channeled into other kind of scientific forms, maybe not your peer, you know, your publication at the end, but certainly in a grant. Maybe that's why I like writing grants better than writing the actual paper. But you know, it's just, you know, I think that that like being mindful of the process will be important.
So David, did you want to say something as sort of I'll give you the last word before we get sent into breakout rooms.
It's by no means the last word, but just it does follow up on what Pooja was just saying about process. And I guess one of the terms, one of the kind of concepts that I've been learning in my new kind of community engagement work is this notion of co-production. And co-production matches very nicely with this emphasis on process. And as a reminder, not only that we needn't be focused on publications or even you know, written narratives, it makes sense to pay attention to the process of narrative generation as itself therapeutic in a therapeutic setting. I've been married to a psychotherapist for 25 years, and it certainly has become clear to me that a huge amount of her work involves co-creating narratives with her patients over hours and days and weeks and years. When they go over months and years, you know, she very often becomes a character in these narratives, but they are authoring a narrative together in a process that has very deep and lasting therapeutic effects.
And I very much agree with that, but I would also say the one thing I worry about sometimes is when, like if I say, oh, I'm writing and someone says to me, oh, that must be really therapeutic. And it's like, that may be a byproduct, but to me, I still distinguish the experience of therapy from the experience of creative nonfiction, you know, but there are obviously all these overlaps and gradations. So I want to be mindful of everyone's time. I feel like we could be talking about in all different directions from here. And I hope that we will find a way to keep the conversation going. I don't know if I need to turn over to our IHPI staff for any final comments, but thank you all for being on the panel, and those of you that are listening now or in a later recording. It's been really great to talk with all of you.
It's been great panel, and thank you all. Yes, Stacy will, anyone who wants to stay on, just stay on. Is that correct, Stacy? You'll start to put people in some smaller groups to keep discussing for a few minutes.